All right, good morning. We're on chapter 26. We'll get going here. We're going to talk. We just got through the time of the 60s. We survived the 60s. There's a funny joke talking about the 60s, you know, love, peace, rock and roll, drugs, all that stuff. I just saw in the news to start class with. One of the things that came out of the 60s was a drug called LSD, right? You guys know about that. Very strong, potent. Expands the mind, but becomes highly addictive, right? Some guy in Missouri thought his coworker needed to lighten up, thought he was too negative at work, laced some of his drinks with LSD, apparently. I just read about it in the news to try to make him a lightened mood. So, I mean, if you're going to lighten the mood of someone, I guess give them LSD. Not really, but I just heard that on the news this morning. I thought you guys would appreciate that. Okay, a couple things. Next week is your work week for your book essay, The Cold War. If you have not read it, get reading it. There are certain questions. Look back, I think it's like February 17th, someone there on the newsfeed. I'll probably repost it again so you can see it. There is the book essay information. It's a pretty straightforward essay. You answer the questions, you kind of set it up as an essay. You'll be good. It's Turabian style. I've given you examples on there. I'll go back make sure I repost all the information so you have it. But do not forget about it. All of next week is devoted to the book essay. I won't lecture next week. We'll take a week off. I may extend the deadline back a little bit, but you have a full week of class to do your book essay. Today I've already posted the chapter 26 reaction quiz that's posted. If you're not getting your reaction quizzes done, please get caught up. All right. The triumph of conservatism. What were the major policies of the Nixon administration on social and economic issues? How did Vietnam and the Watergate scandal affect popular trust in the government? In what ways did the opportunities of most Americans diminish in the 70s? And how did the Reagan presidency affect American aims at home and abroad? So, President Nixon. 1968, LBJ decides not to run again. After the Tet Offensive, the year of all that radical change we talked about, the video showed, there was a backlash amongst formerly Democratic voters. They're tired of what's going on. Richard Nixon, who had been defeated by JFK, now reemerges as a prominent conservative. Won by a narrow margin. I think he only got 43% of the vote this time. Had no desire to battle Congress. Not much interest in domestic policy. Honestly, he ran on law and order. We're going to get back to law and order. I'm going to get us out of Vietnam and all this. Nixon, foreign or domestic policy, in. He really had no stomach for protests. He really had no interest in the civil rights. His big thing he was concerned about was foreign policy. He wanted to be the international darling. The Democrats still controlled Congress, so he didn't want to push anything there. He was basically going to work with them. He's going to come up with what's called New Federalism. He's going to offer block grants to the states. And that's going to be his domestic extent. What these block grants is basically the states have a lot of latitude to do things. We're going to give you grants to carry them out, and you do best how you see fit. You need to do this, you need to do this, here's the money, figure it out. Okay? So New Federalism is basically empowering the states with money to get things done. Mostly interested in foreign policy, talked about he will create the EPA and the Occupational Safety Health Administration, or OSHA. So these are two big things now we take for granted, OSHA and the EPA. Pretty important things that we deal with on a daily basis. Nixon and welfare wanted to replace aid to families of dependent children, AFDC, with family assistance plan or negative income tax. That did not go over very well, by the way. That fails. Nixon and race. He did support conservative Southern jurists with records that supported of segregation, but both rejected. He was concerned about the Southern vote. Now, though these jurors are both rejected by appointed, he shows support for Southerners, and that will help him carry the Southern vote. Though he is not a segregationist, he plays their little game and basically says, I'm not going to go after anything more in the civil rights movement. Does that make sense? So he appoints super conservative judges that are not going to be pro-civil rights, but they're not going to disrupt what's already been established by new legislation and new laws. The Burger Court, Earl Warren retired as Chief Justice in 1969. Warren Burger replaced him. The biggest thing that's going to come in the Burger Court, not fries. Come on, guys, it's Monday. Ha ha ha. Is going to be busing. Extensive transportation of students to achieve school integration. A tool used to achieve integration. There's a lot of protests for parents not wanting to bus or integrate. Many families moved or went to private academics or academies to get around this. Milken versus Bradley in 1974, justice overturned a lower court order that required Detroit's predominantly white suburbs to enter into a regional desegregation plan with the city's heavily minority system. Led a default segregation system based on housing segregation. Essentially, what's going to happen here? Segregation comes to an end, right? Well, to get around segregation or to reintegrate, they're going to start busing kids all over the city to even out the schools. Now, does busing sound like a solution? No. Think of if you're a white kid getting transported clear across town now, or a black kid, just so you can meet all the quota, right? It's not going to be very effective. Regents of University of California versus Bake. This is one of the most interesting cases I've ever came across. Reverse discrimination claims. Affirmative action of setting quotas at schools. Court ruled quotas were not legal. So what Bake did, he sued University of California, saying, I have this score, but I got rejected because you were taking, on affirmative action, a certain amount of black applicants that I had higher scores in. Because they were black, they got in. I got rejected because I was white. Guess what? He won. Universities can no longer use that quota system. I have 10% blacks, 90% whites, or whatever it is, right? It has to go off scores as well. So they had people with lower scores than Bake getting into university. It's still a hot topic today. Let's be honest. You go around universities, you always wonder how some people got in, right? It's not something that is easily done away with today even. President Nixon 3. And what I mean by that is there's still a debate about affirmative action, which affirmative action came along basically equality in college education, the workplace, etc., based on race. The intent of it was good, but the problem with it is sometimes it's just trying to look good and meet the quotas. That's where the system kind of falls apart and has had still issues. The continuing sexual revolution, counterculture sexuality moved into social mainstream. Number of divorces soared, reaching 1 million in 1975, double the number 10 years earlier. One product of the free love in the 60s is you're going to have people get married, maybe not get married, common law marriage, which they live together, don't get married. There's going to be a lot of divorces happen, a lot of family disruption. Birth rate will decline dramatically as well as you have the legalization of abortion, up to 3 months. So there's a lot of negativity towards the traditional family core that you saw in the 50s. By 1976, the average woman was bearing 1 children during her life, less than half of 1957. So in 1957, women were carrying a childbearing of 3 kids per woman, meaning a woman that had 6 kids and one woman would have 0 kids. The average out was about, each woman had about 3 kids. By 76, that had dropped down to 1.7. That's a huge decline in birth. By the way, we've had another decline in birth in the country over the past several years. My generation does not have as many kids as other generations have had. And we're also getting married later. For perspective, my parents got married when they were 20, 21. I got married when I was 27. My wife was 25. Yeah. I had to think there for a second. I'm not telling her age or anything. What she is now. But anyway, the point of it is, we got married a little bit later. My brother didn't get married till he was 32, I think it was. What's that meaning is less kids are born. You get married when you're 20, you might pop out 4, 5, 6 kids. You're more fertile. You got better tendency to pop out more kids. As you get older, the less kids, it gets harder to have more kids. In 1972, Congress passed or approved Title IX, which banned gender discrimination in higher education, and this is most seen in sports now. We talked about that earlier. Why you can't just add a male sport or a female sport without balancing it out and making it equal. And it's not just allowing them to play that sport either. It has to be equivalent, and there's some other formulas, and I'm not an expert on it. I know that's come to light in our school before about it. Continued expression of gay and lesbian movements will continue to expand. Honestly, the gay and lesbian movements will not gain much steam again until modern times. They'll fizzle out in the 80s, and we'll get to that why later on. President Nixon here's a photo during Nixon's early years of his presidency, the whole movement to end the war in Vietnam, etc. A famous photo of a flower being given to a military policeman. Okay, President Nixon and détente. Détente will be a whole invention by Nixon. Conservatives viewed Nixon as soft on communism. They thought he wasn't hard enough. He continued supporting dictatorial pro-American regimes in Iran, the Philippines, and South Africa. Destabilized Chile and led to a bloody coup in which brought a brutal dictator. Some of our policies obviously did not help self-American countries. But he was realist in the Cold War. He understood the Cold War was not a thing of they're good, we're bad. He was more realist than other people had been. And that makes him not a hardliner, obviously, but makes him, we need to change our approach to the Cold War. Thus, he went to China and finally recognized him as a legitimate government of China. This was controversial. He will now replace Taiwan with China on the Security Council. He recognizes China, though they are communist, as the legitimate government of China, not Taiwan. They will allow China to finally join in and take their seat on the UN Security Council. Nixon, first Cold War American president to visit the Soviet Union. He travels to the Soviet Union and has talks with Leonid Brezhnev, better known as very, very bushy eyebrows. If you see Brezhnev, I'll show you a photo here in a second. You Google him, he has a unibrow, basically. And they are bushy. They will lead to SALT, strategic arms limitation talks, détente, cooperation, peaceful coexistence. Basically what détente was we are going to create what's called SALT. We're going to limit our strategic weapons. We're going to peacefully coexist. So détente is a success. Relations with the Soviet Union relax. They're not as tense as they were. So Nixon on the international stage is a very, very competent person. Now, this is going to lead to what the ultimate solution in Vietnam is going to be. Now, moving on to Vietnam and Watergate, Nixon is going to come into the White House looking to try to win and end Vietnam. The problem is with Vietnam, it's really not winnable. He announced a new policy called Vietnamization. On paper, this is a great strategy, though it fails. American troops would gradually be withdrawn, while Southern Vietnamese soldiers would basically backed by Americans, trained by American forces, would do more of the fighting. Did not end anti-war movement nor limit the war. He actually will expand the war for a period. In 1970, American troops went into neutral Cambodia, established a Cambodian government, and brought power to the Khmer Rouge. We're basically going to destabilize Cambodia for our goal, which fails. Before being ousted by a Vietnamese invasion in 1975, it attempted to force virtually all Cambodians into rural communes and committed widespread massacres, horrible genocides committed by the Khmer Rouge regime. For about a decade, they will be killing and massacring people who refuse to move to these communes. All because we wanted to try to go into Vietnam through Cambodia and get to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Just to understand what the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the secret trail that ran from North Vietnam to South Vietnam through Cambodia, which was on the border of Vietnam. Military strategically, it's a good move strategically. Politically, it's a nightmare. As the war escalated, protests again spread at college campuses, the most famous being Kent State and Jackson State University. Kent State was the killing of 9 college students that attacked ROTC students. The National Guard came in and killed the 9 students. Horrible, horrible moment between the military and college campuses. I'm not going to blame on either side. I'll leave it at that. But both things could have went much, much smoother than they did. Soldiers will experiment with drugs, openly wore peace and black power symbols, refused orders, and even assaulted unpopular officers. There's an old saying that in Vietnam, the life expectancy of a second lieutenant, the lowest ranking officer, was very, very short. They did not last long in combat. Either they were killed by their men or they died by enemy forces. Stray bullet, you never know where it comes from sometimes. I'm just going to leave it at that. Discipline collapsed in the military. The once mighty American military now was in shambles. Here's a Kent State photo. Obviously, the images of it galvanized the Americans. And there's going to be a period in American history where the military and the U.S. people are not going to be necessarily super supportive. It will be rebuilt during the early 80s. President Reagan's really going to revive that relationship. But in the 70s, trust in the military, trust in the government had all but collapsed. Vietnam and Watergate 2. Details of the My Lai massacre in 1968 came to light. So 68, if you haven't figured it out, one of the worst years in American history. Basically, what happened was an officer had went in, acted rogue, and wiped out an entire village in Vietnam, killing men, women, and children. There comes a light, the person goes to prison, but it's just a huge, huge black eye on the military. Pentagon Papers are published, a classified report prepared by the Defense Department that traced American involvement in Vietnam back to World War II and how successive presidents have misled the American people. The Pentagon Papers basically said the government had been lying to the people, and this is going to create a huge distrust on who to believe of the government. And then the War Powers Act will be passed by Congress during Nixon's presidency that required the president to seek congressional approval for commitment of American troops longer than 60 days. Meaning the president can deploy troops in the event of a crisis, but after 60 days, Congress has to approve it. Nixon vetoed the War Powers Act, but Congress overrid him. Okay, that concludes today's lesson. Tomorrow we'll get into the conclusion of Vietnam. Basically, the big thing from Nixon is he comes in, law and order president, doesn't really care a lot about domestic policies. The anti-war protests do die down, but they're going to be spurred on by the incidents on Kent State and Jackson State universities. He does escalate the war for a period, which goes very badly. But internationally, the Cold War thaws a little bit. Détente, SALT, he goes to Soviet Union, works with China. So internationally, he's a darling. But domestically, not so much.